Okay. I just got one question. Who the fuck is Freddy, and why are we spending 5 nights at his place? In all seriousness, I understand that Five Nights at Freddy, or FNAF for most of you, is a very popular video game, and it's kind of insane because it's like a mobile game and just slowly became this worldwide phenomenon, which like you don't really see happen, especially because it's a mobile game. I mean, like Angry Birds doesn't even have that kind of following. I mean, yeah, they made a couple of movies off of those, but you know. But look, guys, it's spooky season, we're winding down, we're approaching Halloween, and that means it's time for moviegoers to face the biggest fright of all, video game adaptations. Yeah, that's right, it's Five Nights at Freddy's time, baby, and yeah, look, I understand that people have been looking forward to this for like the better part of a decade, but I gotta say, with the film that we have right now, I'm not on the hype train. Full disclosure, the closest relationship I have to the games is that like some of my cousins have played them, and I know people whose kids have played them and they love them. And like I get it, because I think one of the cool things about Five Nights at Freddy's is the fact that it's like a kid's first entryway into lore and to like understanding something that's maybe a bit more mature than the rest of entertainment at that early, you know, tween age. And so if you're coming into this looking for someone to like give you an opinion as a hardcore fan, it's just not gonna be me. I don't think you could find a person who knows less about this IP. But I've seen the movie, and having done so, I can at least say that, you know, I get, like, a little bit why people would enjoy this, but I don't really understand the appeal. None of my questions have really been answered at all. In fact, all this movie did for me was add another question to my repertoire. Why does this movie exist? But first, it may be spooky season, but you know what shouldn't be scary? Learning. You need to stay sharp if you're going to survive the events of a horror movie, and there's no better way to do that than with this video's sponsor, Brilliant. The way you learn with Brilliant is super intuitive and easy. Their lesson layout and way of engaging with you is super effective and makes learning things on a daily basis so easy. This kind of learning has been proven to be 6 times more efficient than the regular boring lectures you could sit through. Everything you learn in Brilliant, you learn by doing. Creating drag and drop coding, forming charts and graphs, and so much more. The way they present new information makes even the most abstract ideas and concepts easy to understand and relate to. At the end of the day, you'll actually understand what you're learning, which isn't that the whole point of honing a new skill, of learning? You want to be able to practice it, retain it. So to try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for 30 days, visit brilliant.org/filmspeak or click the link in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Again, that's brilliant.org/filmspeak for a free 30-day trial. Seriously, don't miss this. Brilliant rules. I've used their stuff before and I feel like I've gotten smarter myself, which I definitely need that because, whew, yeah, you all probably thinking I'm a big dummy, but thank you so much to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Let me rephrase that. Why does this movie exist as is? Because after years of development hell, a change in directors, all the hype in the world, I mean, you guys, like, a seriously massive fan base, we get this film, and it's one of the most forgettable, half-assed horror movies of the past few years. Five Nights at Freddy's isn't just an ambitious failure, it's a film that treads the water of familiar cliches for an hour and a half and then just fizzles out. And it's a shame because I actually see the potential for what could be a really interesting exploration of trauma, specifically trauma in an older man who is now reflecting upon his youth and how a lot of the things that happened during his time as a kid, some of the horrific things that happened to his family, really affected and shaped the person that he became. I mean, the first time we meet Mike, played by Josh Hutcherson, he's like one step away from beating up a guy in the mall because he thinks something horrible is happening to this kid who's like screaming and complaining. And so like we clearly get a sense that like this guy has something going on that he hasn't really addressed. He has a soft spot for kids, especially kids in need of help. And that's cool. That's interesting. I think there are kernels there for what would eventually become his character arc. And actually, truth be told, I think there's a lot of interesting things that are being explored with Mike, specifically like this idea of dream theory, of basically Mike lucid dreaming to go back into his memories and try and solve the abduction of his younger brother that he hasn't been able to get over. That's like a really cool idea that I think would have been better served in a movie that isn't Five Nights at Freddy's. Like this is kind of like the weird issue with this movie. There is this interesting exploration of childhood trauma, of like reliving the past every single night, not being able to move past it, of it dictating his life to the point where he's neglecting his sister, who he's the sole guardian for. And yet this is something that feels like it belongs in a completely different film, especially with like tonally how serious it's being played. Like, I get that Five Nights at Freddy's isn't just about, oh, it's like killer Chuck E. Cheese and all stuff like that. Like, yeah, I get there's like a pretty heavy emotional core to it, but it kind of feels like we're running through multiple drafts of the film. One where we're taking this interesting sort of introspective look at a man's trauma, and then you know, the Freddy Fazbear sort of thing. And like, yeah, they're touching on similar issues, but I don't think they necessarily are combined in a way that feels natural. It feels like one person's interpretation, another person's interpretation, and someone else's interpretation. Basically, this movie feels like it's been through like 10 years of production hell. We get like 3 different scripts thrown in a blender and it just kind of spits out something else. I think when it comes to a lot of these companies or institutions or whatever, the people behind them obviously have ulterior motives, and they'll entice children through comfort, through like sweetness or I don't know, candy or whatever, as a means to lure them in, and then, you know, they'll bring down the trap. I think Five Nights at Freddy's does that in a very literal sense, where the serial killer who is the mastermind behind Freddy Fazbear's is the guy who's like using these tools as a way to bring kids in, and then he's gonna, you know, abduct them and do God knows what with them. And so I think a lot of these kids feel like they've had their innocence stripped from them at a young age, and that clearly has taken a toll on them, and it's caused them to be in a state of purgatory, I guess, like they're ghosts for a reason. And so a lot of this film, while it's kind of a mess in a lot of ways, to its credit, understands that Five Nights at Freddy's is about kids reclaiming their innocence, reclaiming the images of their youth and taking them into their own hands. In this film, they're using the tools of their killer, both the actual machines and the iconography, and turning them against the people that hurt them, or really anyone for that matter. I think arguably the hardest part with any video game adaptation is translating the feeling of playing that game into a non-interactive format. You know, like Five Nights at Freddy's isn't the first film to really struggle with that. It does almost feel like Mike is this reflection or homage to the way so many of the fan base plays the game, again, off of my limited knowledge. You know, there's a lot of poring over the clues, piecing together the backstory, the lore, trying to look for answers in places that they might have missed in the game, or for Mike, where he might have missed in his dreams. And so, like, I don't know if that was intentional or not, but you know, I think fans will be happy that their culture was represented in the narrative in that sense. Even though it's kind of like convoluted and messy along the way, I think that attempt to reach out to the fans shouldn't be overlooked. I think for me, like, using the animatronics and these like kitty saw traps in an interesting way, the kills, the scares, like that is something that like I kind of would have liked to have seen more of. I understand that's not really the games, but like you have these like really creepy looking things, this like great environment to put together like a mini slasher, and it's like I think maybe like leaning into that, like the fun of that, like the just inherent absurdity of like a fun house or like this, you know, rundown Chuck E. Cheese like establishment establishment and just going buck wild with like the kills, the gore, the violence, because truthfully, this film isn't scary. I don't think a lot of us really anticipated it being scary, but like it's even less scary than what we thought. And the kills are just lacking any sort of teeth, any sort of violence or whatever. It just kind of, it's very cliche. It's like, oh, something pops out of the corner and it's like, bah, and then it like cuts to black. We cut away from the kill as it's happening. And it's like, I've seen that a million times, and you're not doing anything to make it interesting other than having these like, you know, impressive looking animatronics being the ones that are carrying out these attacks. I think towards the end, they tried to connect the dots of like, you know, Mike and his arc and Abby and everything, and then the kids and the animatronics and the killer and everything, like everything that sort of feels like it doesn't relate to one another. Eventually they kind of try to tie it in, like, oh, the abductor who, you know, took your brother, oh, he was the one in charge of Freddy Fazbear's, and he put the kids in the animatronics, he killed your brother, blah, 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 and then, you know, you find out that it's Matthew Lillard, and he's Vanessa's father. But then it's sort of like, why didn't Vanessa do anything about it? Like, I get, like, she felt helpless. I'm sure she was, you know, threatened at one point in time, but, you know, I don't know, it was just like, you just kind of let a lot of stuff happen, like, just for the sake of plot. It was just, it was frustration. I like how the kids, you know, being manipulated by Matthew Lillard sort of try to entice Mike with the fantasy of saving his brother and changing his course by allowing them to have Abby. Just give us Abby. Just give up this responsibility that you don't want so that you can have your dream. And, you know, I think it's a pretty interesting, you know, way of looking at trying to go back and reclaim your youth, of trying to hold on to that part of you. But ultimately, I mean, you know, we can't live in a childlike dream. Like, we can't live in Chuck E. Cheese forever. Eventually, we do have to grow up. We can't live in that headspace. Mike has been like living in this state of trauma his whole life instead of maybe focusing on what's right in front of him and making sure that his sister has a better life than what he has. And like, that's a realization he has to come to. And again, to the movie's credit, there are interesting ideas at play here. They just feel like they belong in a different movie. Nothing really just like connects in a compelling way. The practicality of the sets of Freddy Fazbear's is really impressive. Again, the animatronics, there's a reason they've been like promoting the animatronics pretty nonstop, because it's like the most impressive aspect of the film. When you realize that those are real, tangible things, it makes a big difference. But like, I wish that they were shot more interesting. Like, the cinematography is just so paint by numbers. It's so boring and standard, and like the pacing of this thing is just like a slog. It just, I don't know, like, take the most generic, like, oh, we're gonna try and be gritty and real interpretation of this game and like throw it on the big screen. It's so self-serious and boring, and it's like, come on, guys, like, there's a fun property here, and like, I don't know, maybe this is something that people want from this, but I just didn't really dig it. It's not scary, it's not interesting, it's got one decent performance at the center of it. It doesn't really seem to go anywhere until like the end, and then it's like rushed and happens too fast. The direction is so unremarkable, so bland. You can really see why this thing was dumped on streaming. And truthfully, like, if it weren't for Josh Hutcherson really trying his best and like the few fun moments we get with Matthew Lillard, like, God, outside of those guys, I'm not sure I'd have anything to say about Five Nights at Freddy's. Like, I'm not sure I'd have anything to recommend about this film. Yeah, man, I don't know, just kind of a thing that I watched and have already forgotten about, so yeah.